Dean Crawford is taller than I am, which is not much of an accomplishment. Thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you, those of you associated with the Institute, for having me back. I enjoyed my last stay some years ago, and I'm delighted to be here again. I'm going to start with a story, an anecdote, I guess would be the right word, and in many ways, this is rather a different kind of talk than I usually give, because there's more personal narrative in it than usual. But I think that's important for this particular topic. About 40 years ago, I was the third junior out-of-field reader on a master's thesis presented to the English department of North Carolina State University. The thesis dealt with a modern American author, and it was supervised by the man who was, at the time, director of graduate studies in the department. The second reader, another American literature specialist, was the department head. I had only recently been tenured and promoted to associate professor, and my scholarly specialty lay in English Renaissance literature. My job was to nod thoughtfully, ask a couple of banal, unthreatening questions, and agree with the senior professor's assessment of the thesis. You would think I could hardly fail at such an easy task, but I came rather close. In all innocence, I asked the student how his thesis might apply to other works by the same author, besides the stories on which he had focused. It turned out that he had not read any of them, and this author was not Anthony Trollope or Balzac, whose collected works would fill a library shelf. The committee discussion while the candidate waited outside the room as we deliberated over the fate of the thesis was a little awkward. Well, of course, he's not one of our best graduate students, said the department head. But it's not a bad thesis, said the thesis director, and he worked very hard on it for a long time. I was not much impressed by the thesis and thought that, having worked on it for so long, the student could at least have gotten around to reading all of his author's works. Still, it was not badly written and provided worthwhile insights into the stories that were covered. This was not a hill I planned to die on at that time. Comparing it with student work I read over the next 3 decades, I could now offer it as a model of scholarly endeavor and lucid exposition. After we had invited the young man back into the room, offered our congratulations, and inquired about his current activities and future plans, a remark of his suggested that he was shrewder than I had realized. Like so many of our graduate students, upon finishing his coursework, he had taken a full-time job, and after many extensions of the time limit, handed in a satisfactory thesis. He was working for one of the many companies in the Raleigh area that was making dazzling profits in the rapidly expanding computer business. In just a few years, our newly minted Master of Arts in English had already become the supervisor of all the technical writers at his company. This was the mid-1980s. The English department had been losing scores of majors to computer science. Our administration was frantically adding new courses, dedicated almost exclusively to highlighting something about computers and literature and language. Well, said our department head, I guess the computer courses we offered helped you a lot in your success at work. Not really, came the reply. I only took literature courses when I was here. Besides, you can pick up that computer stuff in a couple of months on the job anyway. This is a rather labored anecdote in which my senior colleagues and I all cut rather ridiculous figures. Trivial as that may seem, however, it has implications for the topic of this conference. For many years, I have risked being thought an etymological bore by insistently reminding readers and audiences that education is ultimately derived from the Latin verb educere, to lead out of, to bring forth. This is why we can still call the education I have in mind, as Dean Crawford does, liberal. Originally, the education of a man who was free of serving other men with the labor of his body, liberal education can now be seen to liberate us from the service of our own delusions, vices, and whims. That is, if it succeeds. The master's candidate whom I helped to examine all those years ago, not our best graduate student, seems nonetheless to have grasped, better than some of his teachers, that literature provides something more important than training in the care and feeding of computers. His imagination had to that extent blossomed. Moreover, he seems not to have panicked, as our departmental administrators had, in the face of technological innovation. His literary education had enhanced his imagination sufficiently for him to succeed in his job in the face of competition from computer science and technical writing majors. An average student in a secular university, he still illuminates our topic. But of course, this was over 40 years ago. I intend to focus on 3 terms from the conference title: education, imagination, and reality. And having called the incident trivial, I mean to come back to that word in its strictest sense. Further, I wish to stress that our most pressing goal as educators is to re-establish the Catholic imagination that once suffused all education in the liberal arts, which developed its distinctive form in the Christian Middle Ages. It was, remotely to be sure, the source of our students' confidence in his study of literature as preparation for life. Sadly, the relationship has reversed. Catholic education in recent decades, in most places, has been increasingly influenced by pragmatic secular notions instead of shaping secular education. This change highlights the main title of our conference, The Rediscovery of Reality. I surmise that everyone knows what this phrase means. Even so, it is worth considering how very odd is the suggestion that reality requires rediscovering. It is, after all, a rather large object to have misplaced. Nonetheless, the evidence is all around us. Critical race theory, which demands that we accept the notion that the history of the United States began in 1619, when, apparently, slavery was also invented. The right to reproductive health care, which consists of measures to ensure that no reproduction takes place. DEI, which insists that diversity requires complete uniformity of opinion, that equity means that every imaginable grouping of men and women must attain statistically identical outcomes in every conceivable activity. Inclusion, that enforces rigorous exclusion of anyone who questions either of the preceding propositions, and transgenderism, which I give up. I can't explain that. I don't usually write 100-word sentences, but I couldn't resist that one. Reality, then, has not so much evaded our vigilance or slipped through our fingers as it has, before our very eyes, deliquesced into an inscrutable puddle of imponderables. How could things have gone so wrong so quickly? How is it that the beneficiaries of the most lavishly supported schooling the world has ever seen, conducted in institutions of dazzling reputation and venerable tradition, have become more detached from reality than any generation the world has seen? And all this in the course of just a few years. Of course, that's not true. First, the problem did not start just a few years ago, and it is not confined to colleges and universities. The poison has been seeping through our entire culture for several generations and infecting the moral and intellectual physiology of every one of our institutions. The disease has developed for the most part slowly and subtly, and the most noticeable symptoms, causing the most immediate alarm, have often served as distractions from even graver corruptions. To put it succinctly, we shall have to restore the Catholic imagination in order to rediscover reality. Unfortunately, we cannot count on simply reforming education as a means of curing the imagination. We need a healthy Catholic imagination before we can meaningfully and effectively reform education. It is, I fear, a chicken and egg problem. And that's why, by the way, I'm glad I'm going first, because I can introduce all these problems and count on the following speakers to solve them while I sit back and watch. Having joked that losing reality seems a difficult achievement, since reality is obvious and all around us, it is incumbent upon me to qualify that observation by noting that we do not so much lose reality as we get lost within it. For reality considered comprehensively is the totality of God's creation, the work of the Logos. Its wondrous complexity and extent far exceed the capacity of our senses, intellect, and perception. We can only be properly oriented within it if we are properly in tune with the divine Logos. But alas, we have forfeited that relationship. Without the grace of Christ, we are like sheep without a shepherd, lost in an endless labyrinth of an alien reality, vainly trying to impose our own design, our own small Logos upon it. It turns out to be unsurprising that reality requires recovery, and Christians certainly ought not to be surprised. We know that, like all men and women, we are sinners. We are descendants of Eve, who chose to find a talking snake more credible than her God and Creator, and of Adam, who decided that retaining Eve's favor was worth ignoring God and accepting his bride's pet snake as a life coach. That's a bit facetious, I admit, but it has a point. Original sin, the first sin, and all of our sins since are first of all evasions of reality. We need to recover reality because, in a sense, we have deliberately run away from it. For most of us, most of the time, wickedness begins in mere foolishness, and foolishness usually involves plunging into the abyss of self, the state of being mesmerized by the plaintive cajolery of the ego. Such self-absorption is what we call pride as a source of all the other sins, which often ends in despair, terrifyingly described by Gerard Manley Hopkins. I am gall, I am heartburn. God's most deep decree, bitter would have me taste. My taste was me, bones built in me, flesh filled, blood brim the curse. Self-yeast of spirit, a dull dough sours. I see the lost are like this, and their scourge to be as I am mine, their sweating selves, but worse. I had to get some poetry in there as an English professor. The real suspense in this talk is going to be whether I spill this glass of water. All right, permit me to offer what may be a surprising, even shocking illustration of what I mean. And this is another rather long story, but I think it's worth your attention. I'm going to take us across the North Atlantic, all those metric tons of salt water, to England. In 1956, Lady Elizabeth Longford, author of well-received biography biographies of Queen Victoria, the Duke of Wellington, and several other British luminaries, edited, and I'm quoting now, a collection of essays by distinguished Catholics on a variety of subjects ranging from sex to the end of the world. I thought they were the same thing, but we called it, she says, Catholic Approaches, to show that it was to some extent tentative, undogmatic. Lady Longford herself would seem to be the perfect exemplar of the ideal distinguished Catholic, author of award-winning books, public-spirited philanthropist, faithful wife, mother of 8 children. Nevertheless, writing about her own essay 30 years later, we're going from 1956 to 1986, she drops with a thud this observation. I quote again. I did not quite convince even myself on my own piece about Catholic marriage, in which I argued for family planning only through the safe period. Today, I can no longer accept that argument. One cannot believe that one kind of contraception is natural and therefore permissible, while all other kinds are unnatural. Or rather, I find that the words natural and unnatural are virtually meaningless in a world of blood transfusions, kidney machines, grafts, and transplants. It is surely the motive that counts in contraception more than the method. If you're interested, that's her autobiography, The Pebbled Shore of 1986. It is not my intention here to defend the Catholic teaching on this subject from Lady Longford's argument. In this context, I am more concerned to point out how pitifully feeble her argument is, even if we allow that it rises to the level of argument. The thoughtless equating of contraception with refraining from intercourse, the suggestion that the concept nature has been rendered meaningless by advances in medical treatment, the founding of moral judgment on that most equivocal of human features, one's assessment of one's own motive. Such comments represent not so much faulty reasoning as recoiling from reason altogether. Lady Longford was, after all, a very intelligent, accomplished woman, with an Oxford degree in Greats and extensive experience teaching. She was instructed in the faith by Father Gervais Matthew, O.P., who was associated with the Inklings. One might have expected her to have known better. But I'm not at this to condemn poor Lady Longford. In fact, she's not altogether to blame. And I mention her only as an example of what was a common attitude among many Catholics by the 1980s. Between the time of her conversion in early 1946 and the publication of her memoir, from which I have been quoting, what might be called the Church's orientation toward the world had altered radically. This is not the place, and I am certainly not the man to offer an assessment of the Second Vatican Council, which has become an exceedingly delicate subject recently. Nevertheless, there is no denying that in the effort to evangelize modern men and women more effectively, spokesmen for the Church assumed an apparently more accommodating attitude toward the peculiarities of Western secular society, just as it was entering a period of relentlessly liberating itself, there's that equivocal word again, even from those moral and cultural constraints that had survived in what was left of Christian civilization in the wake of the Enlightenment. One of the results was a radical alteration in the way Catholics imagined their place in ambient culture. We can see the effects of this in Lady Longford's family life, and I think we get an explanation to some extent of the rather sad passage I read you from her autobiography. A decade before the publication of this memoir, her eldest daughter, Lady Antonia Fraser, another distinguished Catholic author, abandoned her husband, the Catholic Tory MP Hugh Fraser, and father of her 6 children, and began living with the playwright Harold Pinter. In 1977, the marriage between Antonia and her husband was legally dissolved, with Fraser apparently offering minimal resistance, behaving indeed in an eminently civilized fashion. Penter's wife, Vivian Merchant, however, an actress who had performed in his plays, fought the action, and her divorce from Penter was not final until 1980. Penter and Antonia Fraser married in a registry office almost immediately in November of 1980. Less than 2 years later, Vivian Merchant died in a state of acute alcoholism, and in 1984, Hugh Fraser died of lung cancer. According to a review of Antonia Fraser's own memoir of her marriage to Penter, that was published in 2010, published in The Independent, their marriage, Antonia's and Penter's, was, and I'm quoting now, solemnized in 1990 by the High Society Jesuits of Farm Street in a Catholic service of convalidation. That sent me to my Dictionary of Ecclesiastical Latin. Interesting term. It seems that the High Society Jesuit who presided was one Father Michael Campbell Johnston, who, as it happens, passed away in the summer of 2023. According to a laudatory obituary in a Jesuit publication, which begins by labeling the deceased, I'm quoting now, more political than pious, Father Campbell Johnston, and I'm quoting again, was the only cleric whom Harold Penter would countenance at his marriage. I hope it is clear that I am not dwelling on this unseemly bit of gossip from the last century for its own sake. Rather, I ask that you consider the devastating effect that collapse of her daughter's first marriage and her very rapid remarriage to a Jewish atheist who is abrasively fastidious about countenancing a priest at his wedding would have had on Elizabeth Longford. No wonder she was confused. I should mention that in the autobiography, Longford's, she never mentions this incident of Antonia leaving her husband and dumping him. In fact, the only mention of Hugh Fraser is that she thought he was the handsomest man she'd ever seen. Didn't work. Lady Longford had been received into the church in 1945, a number of years after the conversion of her husband. The godfather of her first child born subsequently was Evelyn Waugh. We talked about him when I was here the last time. He who was known to have waited years for the annulment of his first marriage in order to marry a Catholic girl, whose most famous novel, Brideshead Revisited, at that time when Lady Longford was received into the church, just recently published, culminates in a woman's renunciation of erotic love in order not to alienate herself from Christ and his church. Lady Longford must have been shaken to her core by this episode involving her daughter Antonia. It would have been unimaginable to a Catholic at the time when Waugh's heroine Julia Flight provided a plausible embodiment of a loyal Catholic's attitude toward marriage. Between 1945 and 1975, a blink of the eye in the history of the church, the fictional Julia was displaced by the real-life Antonia. A normal Catholic imagination must have been stunned by Catholic reality, warped out of recognition. There is, of course, nothing unusual about Catholics, even Catholics who have seemed loyal sons and daughters of the Church, dismissing doctrine and violating moral law. What is unusual, or at least novel, is the lack of substantial consequences, social or ecclesiastical. After living adulterously for nearly 10 years until the death of Hugh Fraser in 1984, a discrete interval elapses and Antonia marries Penter in a prominent high society Catholic wedding, presumably with all the necessary dispensations. In none of the interviews and reviews that I have consulted in secular or Catholic publications has Antonia Fraser been presented as anything but a perfectly normal, indeed exemplary Catholic lady. So far as I can determine, she blamed Hugh Fraser not at all for the breakup of the marriage. The rationale she gives him for leaving is, because I have found true love. Surely this is a curious notion of love for a faithful Catholic. A view of love that leads her to throw over her Catholic husband and to spend the rest of her life in intimate union with a man who holds her Catholic faith and the Catholic Church in contempt. I venture to suggest that we are here on the threshold of phrases like love is love and love wins. It's only a few short steps. Permit me to reiterate that I dwell at length on this episode not for its undeniable attraction as juicy scandal, but as a kind of parable for what has occurred in the wake of the Church's efforts at aggiornamento. I should mention I assume that Lady Longford was upset by this. In fact, I'm sure she was, because I was upset by it. My wife and I were received into the Church in 1974. She put me on to this wonderful book about Mary, Queen of Scots, and we were reading it avidly, and suddenly there was all this news. I can even remember poor Vivian Merchant complaining about the size of Antonia Fraser's feet. This was, golly, almost 50 years ago. So it was a big news in those days, and it tells us something that Fraser, she's still alive, by the way, it was the last I saw, and giving interviews all the time and being consulted on such matters. And okay, in attempting to update and engage with the world, to bring the mind of Christ into the thinking of the world, the Church has herself been more influenced, not to say infected, by the world than was altogether seemly or salutary. When Lady Longford, therefore, a convert, dismissed millennia of Catholic moral teaching with a casual shrug of the shoulders and a bit of nonsense about the meaninglessness of nature, we must allow that she had ample precedent from the highest authorities in the Church, who effectively shrugged their shoulders when a well-brought-up Catholic woman abandoned her husband and children because she had found true love. And that's why this episode is so important, I think, for the topic of the conference. This is a failure of imagination. No doctrines have been changed or denied. What is abandoned here is the Catholic way of envisioning, of making sense out of reality. Let me try to clarify my point by a real parable of our Lord's. This is the last few verses of the Gospel reading for October 11th in the B cycle. We just read this a month or so ago. The feast, by the way, of Pope St. John the 23rd. I quote, "When an unclean spirit goes out of someone, it roams through arid regions searching for rest. But finding none, it says, 'I shall return to my home from which I came.' But upon returning, it finds it swept clean and put in order. Then it goes and brings back 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, who move in and dwell there. And the last condition of that man is worse than the first." When we tidied up the house of faith and cleared out the attic in the middle of the last century, we seem to have been a bit careless about what we discarded. The old place was so clean and orderly that perhaps the faithful no longer felt quite at home. Their now denuded imaginations. Think of all the images that were bundled off to the local thrift store. I remember vividly the remodeling of the cathedral in Raleigh at that time. Think of all of them. These imaginations, then, were all too vulnerable to those 7 more wicked spirits. It would be easy, facile is probably the better word, to excoriate the usual subjects. It is more useful, however, to recognize that we are all complicit, no one more than myself. As an adult convert, I brought a good deal of secular baggage with me into the Church. Regrettably, in 1974, when I was received, this secular outlook was considered a benefit that I conferred on the church rather than an obstacle still to be removed in my journey to complete union with Christ. In retrospect, I perceive that my conversion was almost wholly intellectual. I'd kind of read my way into the church. I had a great appreciation for the church's grand theological structure and was deeply inspired by her history as she transformed the world by her subtle, luminous thought and luxuriant culture. But I was not much interested in such practices as the rosary, novenas, Eucharistic exposition, benediction, adoration, and frequent confession, and unaware of the importance and their relevance to my own spiritual growth. I could declaim eloquently on Dante's Commedia, Rubens's Descent from the Cross, Mozart's Great Mass in C, and it is certainly no part of my intention to diminish the importance of such monuments to the edifice of Catholic culture. Nevertheless, what I lacked was the repertoire of Catholic habits that transfigure ordinary life and create intuitive attitudes toward even the least remarkable daily occurrences, and thereby prod man toward sanctification of his entire being. In fact, I suspect that children reared in a thoroughly Catholic atmosphere, the kind that I never saw and was really unable to create in my home and got very little help from the church at that time when I was received. I think that children reared in such an atmosphere of these simple, rather down-market Catholic practices are where every incident is regarded in terms of faith, where a routine of formal prayer is augmented by a spontaneous prayerful apprehension of the occasions of day-to-day life. I think these children are going to be more susceptible to experiencing the grand cultural and artistic achievements of Christendom and growing in their faith as a result, the kind of thing that are offered in institutions like this one. It helps a great deal, I suspect, if the ground has been laid. When I entered the church, however, such traditional practices were widely regarded with indifference and were not prominent on the agenda of most ecclesiastical authorities. And I should add, I am therefore heartened by what I see happening in my own parish now. Our past and in what I hear of parishes across the country, our pastor and his associates encourage daily recitation of the rosary, monthly confession by the faithful, provide opportunities for frequent adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, hold exposition and benediction weekly, and offer numerous Christian education classes for adults as well as children. This wasn't going on when I entered the church, and I think it makes a difference. I think what we do in places like this depend upon local parishes. And I think one of the things, and I was heartened to hear about your education initiative, we need to work on that to encourage these things locally, need to re-examine our focus. Parishes that undertake such programs seek to restore a pervasively Catholic ambiance, to saturate their parishioners in the realities of the faith. They are thus mounting the first campaign in the recovery, we might call it the reconquest of reality. These old-fashioned Catholic practices are only effective because they are true. That is, they remind us over and over again that God is the first and last reality in our lives, that his Son has conquered the world and rules it, and that our unconscious assumption that we live independent lives in a merely secular world is a delusion. Given our status as creatures, something that we have a hard time remembering, it behooves us to be aware of the divine presence before all else in everything that we say and do. Frequent reception of the sacraments, frequent regular prayer, and frequent adoration of the Eucharistic presence of our Lord in the tabernacle or monstrance helps to focus our minds and hearts on the reality of the divine presence around us and within us. Catholics, especially educated, sophisticated Catholics, have in recent years neglected these ordinary practices of Catholic life. Hence, the recovery of Catholic imagination must begin at the parish level. Nonetheless, higher education, academic study, and sophisticated cultural discourse remain essential. Children whose world of images has been nurtured in an intensely prayerful and liturgically active parish are far more likely to reach maturity, receptive to the intellectual and cultural riches available in colleges, universities, and seminaries, and it is such higher institutions that furnish the resources by the kind of active parish that I am discussing. But nothing we do at the university level will avail unless we insist that education at the earlier levels revitalize the life of Catholic families. At the risk of sounding paradoxical, if not perverse, I maintain that we have ruined the imagination of children by encouraging them too early and too often to be imaginative. With imagination understood as that which takes us away from reality into a world of our own, shaped to indulge our narcissistic fancies. There is an analogy here with conscience. One ought always to follow his conscience, but it must be shaped in accord with the moral teaching of the Church. Similarly, one ought to exercise his imagination, but the imagination must be disciplined. If we remember that a principal effect of original sin is to lead us away from reality, then it ought to be evident that a healthy imagination, rather than leading us into a world of fanciful dreams, instead introduces us to aspects of the moral universe that we commonly ignore, distracted because of our preoccupation with our immediate needs and desires. As an illustration, consider J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It is properly placed in the genre of literary fantasy. But the concrete elements of exotic fantasy, the elves and orcs and dwarfs and all the magic, are deployed to embody realities of the heart and mind that will elude our ordinary apprehension. The literary fantasy is thus an instrument of moral realism. At the beginning of this address, I promised to get back to trivial matters. My point is that education needs to get back to trivial matters. That is, to the trivium, the foundational study of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. How very unimaginative. All that memorization, rote learning, and imitation of classic authors. That's what you hear. The best response to this dismissal is historical. In the 16th and 17th centuries, for instance, when all education began with the trivium, writers like St. Thomas More, William Shakespeare, and John Milton emerged from our schools, or the schools. They have hardly been bettered by an education incessantly stressing that children ought to follow their own inclinations in order to be creative. But a consideration of poets who are not famous makes the point even more effectively. I'm going to give you a challenge here, a little internet task. Consider, for example, Samuel Daniels' Delia. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands who's heard of it. Most of you probably haven't. But you can find it online. He was a contemporary of Sidney and Shakespeare, wrote a set of sonnets. I challenge you to read through it. It's short, about 50 poems. And then go find yourself something like, say, a current issue of Poetry Magazine, which is going to be about the same length. And ask yourself which one provides more imaginative, more well thought out, more satisfying use of language. We can't do anything at the university level unless students grasp these early ways of shaping their minds. Rigor in education, learning grammar, learning logic, learning the principles of rhetoric, all these things that sound so dry and dull, the imagination rests in them. Without it, it just wanders off into the clouds. I will give you one final, rather painful example. I'm going to quote something. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I promise you It's in a book recently published by an academic press by an individual holding a doctoral degree and a professorial position in an institution of higher learning. And he's also on the side of the angels. No course of study can guarantee the production of good poets. But poetry here is just shorthand for the life of the imagination and its effect in cultural life of our society. If solidly grounded education cannot promise poetry, it ought to eliminate discourse such as this. Please listen carefully. The moral goods of natural law are good, in that their choice worthiness as ends in themselves reflect beatific good of God as the ultimate good and first cause and final end of all things. While the natural law's persuasiveness will stand or fall on its own claims as a testament to its self-evidence, even those who refuse to give God his due as the architect of the natural law cannot fully evade the contours of the natural law. No, I don't really know what that means either, but I did read 400 pages that read exactly like that. And if you are reading newspapers or looking at online essays now, I promise you, you are seeing writing just like this. We have had a catastrophic failure of education. And the first thing we need to do is ground people in reality to get back to it. Although the author of this passage writes with good intentions, it is unlikely that his words would succeed in assuaging Lady Elizabeth Longford's qualms about the validity of natural law arguments. That's not going to do it. The church is enduring a crisis of faith that is in important ways unprecedented. We are experiencing an intensifying conflict with an increasingly hostile world. This is, of course, the perennial condition of Christians. We are, more worryingly, confronted with internal divisions that shake the confidence of the members of the body of Christ of every status and function. Doubt about the church's standing, her direction, and even her teachings have permeated the minds of the entire people of God. Even men and women who affirm every clause of the Catechism share cultural attitudes and practices of the secular world. We hardly differ from our non-Catholic neighbors in our daily lives, and it's very hard to do so. Hence the corruption of the Catholic imagination. We have unwittingly acceded to the individualistic assumption that the imagination is the vehicle for escaping reality rather than the capacity for grasping it with clarity. In closing, I stress again that education and imagination require each other. We cannot reform one without reforming the other. The right kind of education is necessary to form the imagination, and imagination is necessary to benefit from education. Hence the critical importance of early education in what used to be called grammar school, of the trivium, and of the renewal of traditional Catholic practice in parishes. Those of us in the higher reaches of academic life, despite our exalted standing, will be mostly ancillary to this process. At this time, our most important function is the encouragement of teachers in parish schools, insisting on the restoration of rigor, as well as the restoration of Catholic tone and atmosphere in the local church. And this is my final word. Above all, we must pray and never lose hope in our Lord's promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. Thank you.